The next day, I rose early with a signature purpose. While I had to get home to work on my assignment, the bus was not due until the early evening, to which it just gives me enough time to pursue John to come with me in the most dramatic of fashions. To go to the hill myself, I knew that if I returned without any of these strange experiences, that perhaps he would forget about the superstitions nonsense, which the villagers were afflicted by him, and leave on the bus with me. I must do so to confess that what utterly intrigued by the idea of the place. And while I had absolutely no doubt that John's experiences were mistaken, I actually felt that there might be an article, or even a story behind the whole ordeal. As a writer, as such opportunities rarely present themselves. Before I left, I spoke with him and made my intentions clear. He pleaded with me not to go. His fate need not be mine. But after much protestation and procrastination about it, did he accepted it and that I would not be dissuaded, but reluctantly agreed, so that I could return without any paranormal, supernatural, or otherworldly incidents, and that we would leave for Glasgow with me. After providing me the directions, the ones I was sure would not be forthcoming from the villagers, I made my way out to the supposedly tainted hillside. I must admit that when I first saw it, it did appear odd to me, misplaced somehow. But then again, I counted this as a subconscious effects to John's tale. The environment appeared to be just as he had described it, at least that much accurate. The road was just now blocked with rubble and rubbish, and I was too found with a wooden gate lying at the foot of the hillside. There was even a stain of blood upon it, and of course certainly making the conclusion of this story even more believable. The thought of some maniac did give up me a pause, but even if somebody had chased John through the undergrowth, they had probably moved on being confronted by Dale and the landlord. In any case, a badly wounded John had been able to escape, so I felt confident that I would be fine. I did not feel anything out of the ordinary as I crossed the Ferris hold, and while the tangled up of weaves of trees and dead grass did provoke the feelings of decay, I was surprised at just how ignominious and commonplace that the environment felt. After climbing the steep path, which clearly had been used numerous times in recent years, I reached a spot to which it was reminiscent of John's descriptions. And there it was, obscured from the world above all leaves, rotting wood and grass. The church, I was significantly surprised that I had such a big building that would surely have been a part of John's hallucinations, and I concede that I began to feel slightly unnerved by its existence. I hesitated for a moment before proceeding. I am embarrassed to say that the area had not been illuminated by the morning light, and I may have considered retreating. But I did not. The church was fascinating, and I at the very least wished to see it if it was what John said. The altar was undisturbed inside, but it was not difficult to gaze inward, though I shuddered slightly, remembering the description of the door being practically blocked by debris, yet lay wide open unimpaled. It was decrepitly did give me a pause once more. Yet there I stood, on the floor strewn with rubble from fallen roof, and the altar raised up head in description, which was now I had no doubt was indeed read as John stated. It was a doorway leading downstairs towards the unknown destination. You must understand that there is no point I had generally think that something supernatural reside there. At the very idea seemed laughable, but I did begin to question my safety, though thoughts of hermit or mentally deranged recluse living underneath a remote church did not fill me with much confidence. "Hello? Is someone here?" I shouted, my voice echoing up towards the rafters above. With no reply, I castified myself for being so paranoid and stepped inside. Carefully, I negotiated the rubble, noticing the droplets of blood on the broken piece of wood, which I assumed were John's. The thoughts of blood poisoning now entered my mind. Perhaps a wound in the side caused the hallucinations, at least the ones which occurred afterwards. That could have explained his disorientation. The altar stood as he stated. Realizing I may need to prove that there had been, I assured the man, I took up my phone and started taking pictures of the church's interior. With each flash, the hall lit up, and as it did so, My mind crept back to John's descriptions of the zealous priest and fearful congregation huddled underneath the protection of the church, but protected from what? Turning from the darkened doorway, which led underneath the building, I felt my heart begin to race at prospect of descending to the stone staircase, but I was compelled to. Although not entirely of frustic iterations, yes, I did want to show John that there was nothing down here, and that the beliefs which seemed to hold him paralyzed within the boundaries of the village were sustained. But I also wanted to lay down, but beneath myself, why would this church have a subterranean level? Why was there a crypt? My curiosity piqued and my mouth watered at the possibility of a published article describing my discovery of an unknownish archaeological find with perhaps an important and valuable relic or two within. As I approached the door, I could feel the cold air breathing from below. Using the light from my phone, I calmed my nerves down, which had begun to grate on me, and looked cautiously inside. A steep, narrowing light through the stairs dripped down onto the ground beneath. The walls were darkened and gray, which seemed to have been carved or formed, with far less into the rest of the church. I shouted down here once more, but again no one replied, and therefore I assumed that the place was abandoned. As I descended, I was surprised just how long the staircase actually was, and by the time I reached its conclusion, estimated that it was 50 feet beneath the old church, and appeared to be particular to me that a level would be such far beneath the ground, and questioned to myself at the purpose of it. Why had the archnesses, builders, or followers of the church dug so deep? The last step, I composed myself, and turned to face a darkened doorway at the conclusion of the staircase. The blue light above my phone illuminated everything around. What I saw deeply disturbed me. A large room, the floor littered with rags, stone, and human bones. I could not tell how many bodies had left so much to rot there. They were too numerous. The chill in the air was pronounced, and I felt frozen to my core, just not by the cold of the stone which was surrounded by me, but by the sorrowful feeling it felt inside. It was almost as if I could imagine people huddling down there, spending their last moments hidden from the sun. The very imprison I had they had died here, yet I did not know why. I was so convinced of all this. Taking a few pictures, I entered as to what I can only describe as a mass grave. I was careful not to disturb the bones, but I am ashamed to say that I felt the crunch of a few underfoot. To the right lay a doorway leading to another chamber, and while I did not wish to disturb the tomb any more than I already had, I felt compelled to know the entire story, that is, what everyone else was down there. Above the doorway sat a stone cherub carved into a degree of artistic flair, putting up at all odds with the room, full of bones, but childlike face wore a strange grin upon it, not of joy or playfulness, but of taunting and somnambulistic indulgence, and the very sight of it left me feel of revulsion, and quickly I entered the other chamber to be removed from its gaze. Inside the large room, much grander than more than before, I could tell then immediately that something was important to those who had built in the church, had been housed here. The walls were adorned with beautifully carved symbols, some Christian, but many of nature. I could not identify the creature. Of the center of the room lay a block of solid stone, there across feet. A large hole stay into its side on a rock that was following the inscription, "Here lies the Father, loved by some, hated by many." As I pondered through the tablet, I peered inside the hole. The grave was vacant, but as I was glad I had not seen it before walking around the room, as it was deep and wide enough to have given me a nasty fall, being stranded down there with a broken leg was not something I wished to consider. The dirt inside the grave was sustained with black what looked like a deposit of charcoal throughout, and the fringe of the hole was surrounded by a circular pile of dirt. I assumed that the grave robbers, or perhaps those who had hated the man, had removed the body long ago. The air of the place was beginning to affect me intensively. each breath inward and jagged and cold, and the discomfort was such that I had decided that I had seen. While taking a few pictures to document the tomb before leaving, the flash from my phone brought something onto the floor into sharp focus. Covered in dirt, earth and dirt, and lay what a book, poked out from slightly beneath the ground. Gently blowing the dust from it, I carefully lifted it up, resting the book on top of the makeshift gravestone. The binding was ancient, peeling off slightly as I had ran my hand over it. The dark red cover, which I could not identify the material out which had been made, spoke of a time gone and stories of lost yet important. Deep down I knew that such item would be removed carefully and studied by scholars, but as a writer and my passion for my story compelled to me as seeing what it contained. Opening it, I was amazed. This was chronicle and handwritten account of many history of the church, its congregation, and the hillside, a snapshot of the people long since forgotten. It was written in a linguistically confused tone, as the wording seemed to be a mix of old Scots English and phrases of a language unfamiliar to me, one I assumed to be Celtic or Gaelic of an origin. However, the passages of Old Scots I could only read to a degree. What follows was a loose recollection of what had been described to me. In the 15th century, a large group of refugees, who came to the area in search of a place they would call home, the alleys or glens, as they are known in Scotland, were uninhabited at the time. It was too strange that the hill had been dominated by the landscape. The people were from a place called Dungworth, and they all had escaped from the laird there, who had ruled that region at the time, fleeing the persecution in a has brutal and merciless ruler who had punished all who did not follow his beliefs. They all numbered in many only in hundreds, while their elders wished to be settled in glens. The prompted priest amongst them claimed that they have to been best of the lands to ensure that no ills would be befall their community. The hill must be settled at first, a beacon of holiness, and casting a shadow protection to all below. While some were suspicious about the man's fascinations of the place, while he was known for his kindness, and for one those whose judgment could not be trusted, disheartened, and the elders began to follow his example. This is as typical as a time for people to be God-fearing. There that on isolated was a baleful hillside. They had built a small settlement, but almost immediately a few of the settlers began to fall ill, a sickness which cannot be explained but often resulted in feverish madness. The priest blamed a number of standing stones which were prepared throughout the hillside, remains of, to him at least, an old and heretic religion. It was decided underneath the supervision that the people should build a church, with the presence of consecrated ground. It was though as if the effects of whatever resided on the hill previously could be eradicated. They were wrong. Despite their efforts of the sickness, it only grew worse, and many began to suspect this priest himself was a league of the abnormal forces at play. Some of the elders rose up against him, but those under his orders, the members from the church, were the congregation executed for those who rebelled. Fearing for their lives, many of the settlers who were outraged by the priest and his followers fled at the night, escorting the remaining elders to the land below. Most of them made it off the hill, but some returned wailing frightened, believing themselves to be stalked by uncertain, unearthly figures in the woods. Unable to escape, to save their lives, they only pledged undying of fellowship towards the priest and his church, claiming to be the receiving the visions from the Almighty himself. The holy man assured the villagers that if they carried out his explicit instructions, that they would be allowed to save. Each night they gathered around the church as the priest spewed forth from his visions, damning, seething, and hatred for those who had left. It became clear to those who had gone mad, but then it had formed a strict and brutally local conclave of followers, who have hung every word in prophecy, making rebellion to be sure to be violent, bloody, and uncertain one. Many of the dreams spoke without form, blinded by the darkness, and several families were found in their homes suffocated at night. The priests who blamed those who escaped, who told stories on how they were sources of darkness to which it was persecuted by his people, cursing them into desperate end. Bitterness and anger that swept through the community, and several villagers that were selected descend the hill and bring back the elders, who to be judged and sacrificed if need be. But no one could leave, no matter how hard they tried. The church loomed large. No matter which way they walked, up or down, they would reappear where they had begun, confused and disoriented. The sickness had spread. The village had watchmen had been only there were found choked, mutilated in the streets, with witnesses claiming to have seen strange entities prowling around at night. In panic, those had left no option but to cling their religion for salvation, in hope that the church would protect them. They would huddle together underneath its roof in abject terror of what approached them in the shadows from outside. Here, the writing changed markedly, from becoming jagged, virulent, and more pronounced. The priest himself had taken over the town chronicler, who he had deemed to be unsatisfactory. Several pages followed pockets of English, intinged with what looked like Latin, and a number of unusual, undescribable languages. Each page was filled with a plaint and scorn for those who had left, and then the woods had just stopped. Standing there was the stage again, in foreboding place. I ran my fingers passed across the spine from the book, that I could clearly see the last page had been torn out. What was contained, I did not know. I felt overwhelmed by the account, which I had just had several real palpable fear search throughout my body. The thought occurred to me that the accounts of the sickness had been plagued the exiles of Dungworth seemed to be remarkably similar to John's experiences. I could not avoid the coincidence, and I began to suspect something had infected him. After all, something tangible, perhaps a contentment in the ground, a poison maybe? I had read about the pockets of the methane gas escaping out from the earth and at sea, which had killed many. But it was not out of the question that something similar, perhaps a smaller dose, that could have affected and caused mass hallucinations, sickness, and even madness. It was the most feasible explanation I could come up with. Yet, why have I not been affected? Perhaps the chronicle had stated some people who are more immune to this contentment than others. My attention now turned once more to the grave, or at least what was left of it. I wondered what the people did with the body of the loved but hated by priest, assuming that who was the father referred to. Did they rebury him in a different location? Perhaps his followers were worried that his grave would be vandalized. The answer could become clearer to me almost immediately. They had burned him in his grave underneath every church he had built. The hole where his body once lay was now marked internally, but blackened stains by the smoke and ember. I shuddered for the thought, as though he may have been thrown down there and set alight while he stand alive. The air now grew noticeably colder, but this was not what marked the beginning of my ordeal. I leaned over, looking closely at what I had saw at the rim of the grave. I could not bring myself to believe it. There, standing at the brim of the hole, was the casualist signature left by the church's former attendant. In the darkness I must have missed it, but now it was unmistakable. There were the edge of the graves that had handprint, blackened and burned, as some of the drunk clawings were made their way out of the internal and forsaken pit. My breath spiraled slowly out of my mouth, congealing the icy surroundings. While my heart raced, there was a possibility of what had risen from that hole in the ground. As the air grew colder still, I stood up and made my way to the foot of the stairs. I had to get out of there into the sunlight, into the open. It was then I heard it. At first it was merely the impression of sound, but more definite. Rising intensely in clarity, something stirred above. People, many of them groaning and lamenting, crying for their lives in illusion. Chants of the darkness below, both Christian and something older. A fated religion that had been left the ground, as the wails of misery ascended. A single voice rose up at the colored pony. Deafening was terrible, and it spoke at the end of days of betrayal and unpleaded sin. The voice yelled and screamed, renouncing all who did not listen. A vengeful sermon from the stone above. I cannot put the fear I felt into words. Alone in the cold darkness of a defiled crypt, with no way out other than up and into that church hall, there was something hideous, now relieved and forgotten in terrible times. The screams grew louder as the bangings and scuffling of feet rushed forwards to the staircase, towards where I stood. Such pain in those voices! I ran in terror as they flew down the ancient staircase towards me. Without thinking, I jumped down for the empty graves, switching my light from my phone to off, and found myself cowering, shaken to my very core in agonizing voices, which had cried out against the world, and one another to the other room. Hate and utter despair in such evil, both outside and in. The roar of agony increased, men, women, children, weeping and cursing God that they had believed was forsaken accusations, persecution, and even though through the tearing of flesh. Then silent, I clung onto the bottom that charred a grave, with my fingernails etched to the soil. Any skepticism I had foreseen, and hidden forces that reduced, shaking violently in the cold bleakness. I waited for several minutes before switching my light on my phone back on. Peering over the brim of the grave, I pulled myself silently onto the floor. The rooms were all empty, all but for the broken bones and skulls of countless lives ruined by whatever lay in that hillside. I finally plucked up the courage with my nerves, shredded in beliefs and shattered, and I climbed up the stairs slowly, scared rigid at the thought of what might be waiting for me at the top. But it was my only way out, and I would be damned if I was going to end my days where those poor people had cowering deep below. The hall was empty. As quietly as possible, I crossed the room, negotiating debris and rubble as quickly and quietly, cutting through the operation of silence, finally exiting out of the doorway to the open air. Once out of the church, I fell to my knees, quivering with anxiety as I tried to process the entire experience. My mind had flew back to what seemed to be in that grave, and more importantly, as where it is now. Then I knew it. Running as fast as I could through the bushes and thickets, I reached the path quickly, impeded on whatever evil blocked the settler's escape. But I did not stop. Half filled with terror of what I might have been in pursuit, and half pleading for my instincts to be wrong. The air burned into my lungs as I rushed down the path. Within minutes, the wooden gate was in sight, and I was off to that wretched hill. A place that I would never tread again. Not for money, not for a story, not for anything. I would have breathed a sigh of relief at though, but it was not for my mind. I had to get back to the inn as quickly as possible. Continuing to run as fast as I could, I fought the exhaustion and the limits on my own body. After some time crossed around the hedgerow. Finally the Laird of Dungworth came into view. Staggering towards the old building, it was then I heard it. Screams of agony and terror, and for mercy. I knew instantly where and by whom, and a new-found jolt of stamina found me. At least I broke into a sprint once more. Bursting through the doors at the bar, there in the room lay in silence. Villagers sat staring at their drinks, while the landlord himself stood motionless, his eyes pointed at the ground. The screams continued the rooms above. I begged and pleaded for someone to help me, but no one would really listen. Realizing I was alone to confront it, I broke for the stairs, but the landlord forcefully intervened, dragging me back, his arms wrapped tightly around my shoulders. "Leave him, son. You can't help," he yelled, as two other men attempted to restrain me. I thrust my elbow into the stomach of the landlord, and then began to barge upstairs, past the two men, knocking one to the floor, tearing up the stairs. I followed the awful cries straight to John's room. The door was locked. Thrusting my shoulder against the door again and again, it cracked and splintered against my efforts. With each strike, I heard the garbled gasp of something unearthly inside in response. Finally, the door gave way, and I went in. For a moment, I glimpsed something that looked like a man, at least something which was alive. The blackened and burned, and it turned as if its head to stare at me. I cannot say whatever it truly saw me, it had no eyes to speak of. In its grip, it crumbled in lifeless body of John R. It then turned, wriggling through the opening window, carting the poor man's body behind. They were both gone. The room they had taken a violet and fluid appearance. I do not know if this was the exertion of my efforts, or just being the proximity of grotesque miscreation, but sickness overcame me, seeping through my stomach as I lost consciousness. I cried out in helplessness. That was several days ago. It seemed I had banged my head against the floor when I collapsed, and somehow injured my leg in the process. The village doctor who examined prescribed me some antibiotics, what he believed to have been a stomach infection, and a sedative to help me ease my anxiety. With a little else to occupy, I have committed everything I can remember about this horrid ordeal to a paper. After all, a writer writes. Yesterday I visited John's room for the first time since he was taken. It was silent, and it felt empty in a way I have never truly known before, an absence of his life as best as I can describe it. The place lay ransacked. His belongings were strewn across the floor. I assumed that no one had been there. The landlord was probably too frightened, but I do not blame him. As I turned to leave now the vacant room, I noticed one item that looked out of place. It did not belong. On John's bed lay a withered and stained piece of paper. I knew where it had come from without even needing to read it. The last page was of the Chronicle, the account of those who had settled on the hill. A maze of repeated phrases, arcane and even forgotten languages spread out across the crumbled, fragile paper. But no one in English stood out about it. It simply said, "No one leaves." I do not know what to make of anything anymore. I feel exhausted, yet my mind still picks over the last few days piece by piece. I am still wrecked with guilt. Somehow I feel my every presence on the hill was brought by whatever were back down there to take John. Otherwise, why did it wait so long? My last thought of the matter was perhaps I might have been lucky, and that I visited the hill when that thing wasn't on probably would have saved my life. In any case, regardless of how the villagers had tried to explain this, I will be reporting John's disappearances when I arrived in Glassgrove and asking the police to take a number of the residents who have went to the missing area over the years. I think they would be surprised by the number. Home seems to millions of miles away, but I know that I'll be there shortly. To do down my own bed, another for world far away from the events for the past few days. Perhaps there I'll be able to put this madness into context. I have never been so homesick. Hopefully, I'll be there in a matter of hours though. The bus out of the village is running a little late.